Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Boris. It's a real pleasure to be asked to speak to you today. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I hope you can hear me. And what I am going to do is tell you a bit about what we know about how cetaceans fare in captivity. So today I'm going to talk to you about big brains and small spaces, the impact, the welfare impact of captivity on cetaceans. And if I can, trying to, okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so when we want to know about the welfare of any member of another species, there are three questions we can ask. And in particular, these questions are highly relevant to what you can ask about any animal who is living in a captive situation. The first one is, who are you? In other words, whether you're a lion or a bear or an elephant or a whale, who are you? Not only individually, but also as a member of your species, because that is going to be the basis for determining whether or not that animal is living a good life. And then once you've determined that, what do you need to thrive? And how do you figure that out? Well, one way to do that is to go to the natural setting and to see how counterparts live in the wild. Now, this is not to say that everything in the wild is wonderful, but it is a reflection of the evolutionary history and adaptations of that individual animal's species. And so it can be used to address the question, what do you need to thrive? And then the other question, which comes with that, is in the situation you are in, if you're in a marine park or an aquarium or a zoo or living in some other way, do you have the opportunity to thrive? And I emphasize the word thrive or flourish here because welfare is not just about eking out an existence or just living from day to day. It really is about whether or not an individual has the opportunity to flourish. And that's very important. So just to give you some background on cetaceans, we're going to be talking today about a very small subset of cetaceans. But as you know, there are upwards of 85 to 90 different species, 95, depending upon whether you lump or split. And most of the work that I've done is with both the Delphinidae, the family Delphinid dolphins, and Monodontidae, beluga whales. And only the odontocetes, the toothed whales, are kept in captivity. So those are the ones we will be talking about today, and specifically the orcas, the bottlenose dolphin, and the beluga whale. But also what I have to say relates to a few other dolphin species as well. It's impossible to, in an hour's talk, give you a sense of the lives of wild, free-ranging cetaceans. So I'm going to hope that this description, this list, will suffice to give you an idea of the answer to the question, who are you? Who are you? Many cetaceans live in strongly bonded, complex social networks. And these networks are shaped and held together by deep cultural traditions. Those cultural traditions involve dialects, foraging habits, all kinds of things, mating. These cultural traditions are passed on from one generation to the next through learning, and they're very important for not only survival, but for flourishing. As a neuroscientist, I've studied the brains of dolphins and whales for many years now, and I can tell you that their brains are not only large relative to their body, but very complex. Years ago, we used to think that the cortex, or the part of the brain that does a lot of cognitive processing in cetaceans, was quite simple. But we now know that that's far from the truth, that their cortex and the rest of their brain has a tremendous amount of differentiation and complexity in it. Cetaceans, just in general, have very long juvenile periods where they are able to learn how to be a member of their species from their mother and from other members of the group. They have lifelong social bonds, and some of them are matrilineal with post-reproductive lifespans. For instance, orcas have menopause, and what happens is that the older female in the group may stop reproducing herself in order to spend more time assisting with the rearing of her grandchildren. Their social networks are enormously complex. In many bottlenose dolphin communities, there are tiered hierarchical levels of social organization. And of course, what we know about these animals in general is that their communication abilities are quite sophisticated. And we don't really know everything. I mean, we hardly know anything about their communication systems, but we do know from a lot of work done using quantitative analysis that their communication systems are quite complex. So just to turn to the brain, because I often say, you know, that big brains don't belong in small spaces, right? And this is the reason why. On the right is a human brain, and our brain is about 1,300 grams in size, and our brain is very wrinkled on the surface, and that means that our cortex, where we do a lot of cognitive processing, has a lot of surface area. Our brain is also about 7 times the size you would expect for an animal of our body size. That's why our EQ is 7. But I've also found many years ago that many cetacean species have EQs, encephalization quotients, very close to modern humans, in the 3, 4, and 5 range, showing that even though their brains are large and their bodies are large, their brains are actually a lot larger than you would expect even for their body size. So as an example, let's look at the orca brain on the left. This brain is 5,000 grams, and it is 2.5 times the size you would expect for an animal the size of an orca. So it's highly encephalized, but it's also the most gyrified brain on the planet. And you can see the surface area is covered with all kinds of wrinkles, and it's actually more wrinkled than the human brain. Now, the cortex of the cetacean is thinner than the human, but they've made up for it through more surface area. And what that means in terms of cognitive processing is not clear, but it tells you something about these species. It tells you that their brain has had to pack a lot of tissue into their cranium over time. Also, the orca brain has the highest corticalization level of all animals, including humans. That means that the cerebrum, the part of the brain here that is involved with thinking and information processing, accounts for a higher percentage of the total brain volume than in humans. So if you look at the brain on the left and the brain on the right and say which one does more processing of information per size, it's the one on the left, the orca brain. And that's very intriguing because it tells you something about their intelligence and their cognitive sophistication. So now I'd like to contrast briefly life in the ocean versus life in the tanks for a specific species, orcas. In the ocean, orcas can travel up to 75 to 100 kilometers a day. They dive deep to 400 feet or more. They have different cultural traditions, very long juvenile periods of many years. Their bonds can be lifelong. Their mothers raise their calves and they live in very complex social networks. Now, in a traditional captive setting, like an entertainment park, an aquarium, we see a very different kind of life. They're either overcrowded or in solitude. And there's really nowhere to travel. The tanks tend to be barren and quite shallow. In fact, not allowing for more than one body length diving. They are often forced to perform and have contact with people, including the public. And they are held in what can only be described as an artificial collection of individuals. It's not a natural social group. It's not a culture. And there's often forced separation of mothers and calves. And what that does is set up the calves who are developing under these artificial impoverished conditions to then have their own problems when they become adults and become parents. So what is the scope of this problem? Well, there are over 3,000 whales and dolphins and porpoises held in captivity around the world, concrete tanks and some sea pens. In North America alone, there are 480 bottlenose dolphins in entertainment parks, 69 beluga whales, and unfortunately, the number of orcas has dropped from 20 to 19. In Canada, there are about 35 beluga whales and 5 bottlenose dolphins, and they all reside in Marineland, Ontario. And those 35 beluga whales is kind of an estimate because we don't really have good records coming from that facility. Now, I just wanted to note something that you're all aware of is that last week we lost the orca Kiska. Kiska lived at Marineland, Canada for 40 some odd years. She was taken from the wild in Iceland. And for the past 12 years, she lived entirely alone. So I just told you about the social complexity and the social bonding. That's an important part of these animals' lives in the wild. Kiska, unfortunately, had 5 children over the years. They all perished. Also, for the past 12 years, she's been entirely alone, meaning that she has not had the company of any other cetacean. So think about that. She just swam in circles and eventually succumbed last week. And so this is an example, a heartbreaking example of the typical outcome for orcas in captivity. My colleagues and I have done a lot of research on what the impacts of living in concrete tanks does to dolphins and whales, and we published that. And I'd like to review some of those findings with you. There are several different areas where we see welfare is compromised in captivity for orcas, bottlenose dolphins, beluga whales, and others. The first is in systemic illness and opportunistic infections. In captivity, dolphins and whales die of pneumonia. That's the most common cause of death. Other lung diseases, candidiasis, gastric ulcers and other stomach illnesses, encephalitis, bacterial infections, and so forth. And while it is true that those that are free-ranging also suffer from these illnesses, one must ask why these are killing those that are in the tanks. If their water is supposed to be of high quality and they have 24/7 veterinary care, why are they succumbing to these opportunistic infections? And by opportunistic infections, I mean infections that take hold when the immune system is weakened. And we wrote a paper a couple of years ago suggesting that these systemic illnesses, opportunistic infections, are so prevalent in captive orchids because of the chronic stress of living in an artificial impoverished environment and having to deal with that and the effects of chronic stress on the immune system, which are very well known. We also see common signs of mental illness, behavioral stereotypies, circling. Kiska, who you see here in the center, used to have a stereotypy where she would go to a specific part of her tank and bash her body back and forth. She also, as you can see, had teeth worn down to the gum. And that's very common in captive orchids, and it's an oral stereotypy. We've also seen them banging their heads against the sides of the tank and so forth. All of this shows that there's some kind of brain dysfunction. And we see depressive behaviors, anorexia, logging, immobility on the surface. We also see disturbed social interactions, hyperaggression towards other orchids and other cetaceans, including calves and humans. And again, I have to repeat that, the orcas have killed 4 humans in the tanks, have injured severely many, many others, but there's never been a case of anything like that when humans encounter orcas in the wild. There's also a legacy of poor parenting and failure to attach and thrive that I am currently looking at with some colleagues as a research question. Poor parenting and the impacts of that and how it comes down through the generations. And of course, there is low survivability, high mortality. Most orcas and belugas live about half as long in captivity as they do in the wild. And yet they are fed, are given veterinary care, and are supposed to be in a safe environment. Bottlenose dolphins do a little bit better, but not very well. I just want to mention the stress response because this is really something we're looking into as a very important component of how well these animals do in captivity. I won't go into all of this in detail, but for those of you who have studied physiology, biology, psychology, you know that there is a stress response that all animals use to respond to acute stresses. And it involves letting out adrenaline and the hormone cortisol when you are faced with a stressful situation. That's called the HPA axis. But when the stressful situation does not reset itself, does not go back to normal, then you have a chronic stress situation. And that chronic stress situation results in tremendous damage to the brain, to physiology, to the immune system, to the organs, and it eventually maintains itself in some kind of a positive feedback loop that the animal can't get out of. And we think that that's what's going on with captive cetaceans. Now, the reason we think this is because the effects of captivity and the stress response, including the neural circuitry for stereotypies and other aspects of the stress response, are similar across species. And this is a figure from one of our more recent papers on the neural effects of captivity, where we have sections drawn through an African elephant brain, a bottlenose dolphin brain, a human brain, and a rat brain, not to scale, of course. And we've color-coded some of the structures in the brains of all mammals that are involved with the stress response. And as you can see, we see the same circuitry, the same structures in the elephant, the dolphin, the human, the rat. And that tells us something. It tells us that the parts of the brain that respond to stress are highly conserved across all species, and that we can infer that the things we're seeing, the problems we're seeing in orcas and other cetaceans in captivity are due to the same kinds of problems you see in other species in artificial, impoverished environments. What are the sources of chronic stress in captive cetaceans? Physical confinement, lack of social support, sensory disturbance because they're highly acoustic and there's often a lot of noise in an entertainment park, loss of autonomy, and boredom, which is a highly stressful condition to be in. So I've told you something about what we know so far about big brains in small spaces. What happens to cetaceans when they're forced to live year after year after year in a concrete tank that is essentially an impoverished environment and does not provide for their needs? They are far from flourishing. They are hardly living. And I hope I've given you some of the scientific evidence to show why that is the case. Now, I want to turn to another topic that is related because it's the topic of what we do about this situation. And in 2016, some colleagues and I founded the Whale Sanctuary Project because we realized that the only thing we can really do to help these animals is to get them out of that situation. But we can't just take dolphins and whales who were born in captivity and put them back in the ocean. There is no going back because they didn't come from anywhere and they don't have survival skills. So the best we can do for them is to provide a sanctuary, an authentic sanctuary that creates a situation that is at least closer to what they would be experiencing in the wild. And so the Whale Sanctuary Project is a nonprofit organization that I'm the president of, and we work to transform the way people relate to whales and dolphins by ultimately wanting to bring an end to their exploitation in entertainment parks. We do several things. We create seaside sanctuaries, and I'll tell you about the one we are creating in Nova Scotia. We assist with international marine mammal rescues and other sanctuary efforts, and we advance whale and dolphin science. So first, what is an authentic sanctuary? An authentic sanctuary is a place where you promote not just living, but thriving. It's where well-being and lifetime care are the priorities for the residents. It's not a visitor experience. It's not ticket sales. It's not revenue. It's all about the animals. There are no performances, no breeding, and no unnecessary invasive medical procedures. There is a promotion of autonomy and a natural life, and education can be authentic. You don't have to try to convince people that the animals are necessarily where they should be, because they should be in the ocean. You can do important conservation work and be totally transparent about why dolphins and whales and porpoises belong in the ocean, not in captivity. I should mention that in a couple of months, we will be making public some work we've been doing with the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, where we have developed guidelines for accreditation for authentic cetacean sanctuaries. So let me introduce you to where our sanctuary is going to be. It is in Nova Scotia, and we spent 2.5 years going up and down the coast of North America, searching for a proper site. And it is in the northeastern region of Nova Scotia, about 2.5 hours up from where you are now, Halifax. And this is the site. This is Port Hilford Bay, and it will be the site of the first seaside sanctuary for both belugas and orcas in North America. And as you can see, this is a tremendous, tremendous bay. And we are going to actually net off 100 acres of that bay. So here's an artist's rendition of the design of our sanctuary. And we are already designing the net, the buildings, and much of the infrastructure already. We've been doing that for the past couple of years. And this is a 100-acre space enclosed by a mile of net. And that space is so large that if you stood on the coast, on the shore, you would not be able to see a beluga whale who is on the far side of that site. So is it big enough for these animals? It'll never be big enough. Captivity never will be big enough for dolphins and whales. Is it orders of magnitude better than the largest captive facility in the world? Yes. And it also has good depth to provide diving, and it's a completely natural environment. There are fish and crustaceans that will come through the site. There's a natural bottom. It's an ocean environment. And we hope to give residency to about 8 beluga whales and 2 to 3 orcas, and they will be separated. But this site is so large that we can do that. There will be a full service veterinary facility on site, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those other things as well. We will be doing a lot of education and outreach, and through Dalhousie, through other universities and schools. We will be creating an interpretive center elsewhere, not on the site itself, but elsewhere, where people will come to see remote webcams of the animals and how they're doing in their new environment. We will have a full service animal care veterinary service operation on site, and we will be offering veterinary internships through our sanctuary and marine ops. So this will be a full service facility that will provide lifetime care for several beluga whales and possibly orcas coming from concrete tanks. And we have been at this for a long time, several years now, and we never thought that it would take this long to create something like this. But we've learned that when you are creating something so novel and so big in scope, that it does take a long time. And we are hoping to welcome our first residents in the spring of 2024. We have made great strides in fundraising, in permitting, in leasing the water space, in community and First Nations engagement, and government and provincial engagement. And there's just a lot to it, but we are moving ahead, and we are going to get this done. And, you know, unfortunately, it won't come in time for someone like Kiska, who recently died at Marineland. But, you know, we have to remember that there are 35 to 40 beluga whales sitting in tanks in Ontario. And we would like to find a way to bring at least some of them to our sanctuary when it's open. So that is just a very brief talk about why sanctuaries are important, what we're doing to try to respond to those problems. And you can find out more about our sanctuary here at www.whalesanctuary.org. And I'm looking forward to questions, comments, and discussion. Thank you.